Hello, my name is Russell, and I'm 20 years old. Is this the way every story here starts? And then they start complaining about how terrible their life is, blah, blah, blah. Well, I will begin my story differently. Everything is fine with me. At least, I prefer to think of it that way. I don't like to seem like a whiner to people, but my story started with death, as many sad stories here do. When I was 7 years old, my grandfather, my mother's father, died. But there was very little grief, as he, frankly speaking, was a really mean man, but he was also a very rich man. I didn't know it all, because he refused to talk to his daughter or to meet his grandson, so I can talk about this with a bit of, optimism. My mother spoke very little about her father. I only knew that as soon as he had the opportunity, my grandfather sent my mother to a private school somewhere up in the Swiss Alps. This school was supposed to transform her into a beautiful, noble lady, but the transformation failed. The only thing that my mother got from this education was that she now had no doubt about her European background. This fact didn't prevent her from jumping at the opportunity to marry the first guy that crossed her path, and that just so happened to be my father. My grandfather did not approve of having some woodcutter as his son-in-law, and no, he wasn't exaggerating. My old man has really been working as a woodcutter all of his life, so my mother didn't have the blessing from my grandfather before she got married. And along with this, for the better part of her married life, she didn't get a penny from my grandfather's pockets. That's why my childhood was pretty nice, but poor. Dad worked hard, trying to make enough money for his family to live, and my mother stayed home to raise me. From the age of 25, approximately, she suffered from a chronic hereditary joint disease. The arthritis even prevented her from doing housework, but my mother somehow managed to cope, and she also couldn't get a job because of it. But then my grandfather died, and everything that he owned became my mother's. I don't think she had ever counted on that. But my mother got everything. Grandfather's home, his business, and his bank savings. As soon as she legally had the inheritance, she sold everything that could be sold and left my dad and I. I have every reason to believe that it wasn't just the bad joints, but also the dubious moral qualities that were genetically transmitted to my mother from my grandfather. Dad took this all philosophically and calmly gave her the divorce without any claim for her money. First, he had his pride, and second, he didn't have money for a decent lawyer. But let me remind you, I'm not complaining. There are some advantages to being raised with only a father. It's cool in its own way, something like living in a true bros club. Never mind. After the divorce, my mother flew to Europe. Life in a relatively small city near the Canadian border seemed boring and depressing to her. You do remember her European background, right? Well, she perceived the old world as a place for high society. Maybe the transformation into a beautiful, noble lady had finally been completed. Anyway, as soon as she was done with all the formalities, my mother began her journey through every country in Europe. Yep, she never bought a house or an apartment. Instead, she just regularly changed cities and countries, met new people, and lived a luxurious life, as she imagined it, for herself. I learned all of this through the most detailed reports about her life by talking on Skype and these huge archives of photos she was sending me. Yes, oddly enough, my mother didn't cut off contact with me, and she even tried to remain friends with my father. However, my mother didn't send us any money, and neither I nor my father asked for anything. Over 10 years, my mother took me to Europe 3 times for vacation. Once to the island of Crete, once to the north of Scotland, and once to Romania. So I saw with my own eyes that my mother spent money, moderately enough. Her luxury was more demonstrative than real, more intended to make a good impression in pictures, as it is often the case on the internet, by the way. The only thing she didn't do was work, and that made sense considering her arthritis had progressed and brought her more and more physical pain. But I still wondered quietly, how much money did the late Scrooge, my dear grandpa, have? But a couple of years ago, a new character popped up in this story. His name was Mark. It seemed that he was from somewhere in Eastern Europe where my mother had met him, and, in fact, this was more or less the only reliable information that I had about him. I didn't know his last name or anything else which could help me to identify him. The information that he gave to my mother was, with a high degree of probability, fake. And soon you'll understand why. Mom claimed that Mark was a practicing certified doctor, and they met when the pain from her arthritis became especially severe. She went to see a doctor and met this Mark guy. I don't know which methods and means Mark used for treatment, but after some time, Mark unexpectedly became not only her doctor, but also her boyfriend. Of course, I understood that my mother has been divorced for more than 10 years. She'd probably had other men, but they came into her life and went away. But with Mark, it was a completely different case. I met him during my last vacation with my mother in Europe, so I took a good look at this rogue and noticed how he influenced my mother. As you might have guessed, Mom was never very judicious, but now it had become a bit of a nightmare. First of all, by accident, I found out that my mother gave Mark full access to all of her accounts. He was supposed to plan their family budget, while their family income had already passed zero and was now approaching negative numbers. Yes, this certified doctor didn't earn anything at all, but my mother didn't mind that they lived exclusively at her expense. She claimed that this was only going to happen during her treatment, and as soon as her joints became strong and elastic, they would start living a normal life. Mom admitted to me that for the first time in her life, she wanted to get married. To Mark, of course. I tactfully refrained from asking her how she had felt when she married my father. Was it against her free will? I just hoped that she liked her present life, where there was no place for any memories of my father. She also added the possibility that they would both move to the U.S., and I didn't ask anything about what had happened to her European background. Everything was forgotten and given up. Mark was her only interest now. She even told me that Mark was exactly what she had been looking for all these years in Europe, that he was her fate. Ugh, disgusting. Really disgusting, don't you think? My dear, greedy, and egotistic mother, whom I loved and knew so well, was totally not herself. She had never been prone to any kind of romantic enthusiasm before. I began to suspect that Mark was giving her some kind of tricky pills. But it turned out that he wasn't giving her anything that could be bought in pharmacies. In addition to all his qualities, this certified doctor was an apologist for alternative medicine, even though my mother assured me that he was a doctor. Unfortunately, this was the last fact that I managed to find out personally. My vacation was over, and I had to go back to my father. After that, my story stops to be as detailed as it was, because I didn't witness any of what happened next. As for my mother, she either pretends that she doesn't remember most events, or is really suffering from amnesia now. Even when she testified to the police, they were unable to find out more, so I bet you're interested in what happened next. Mark convinced my mother that in order to cure her arthritis, they absolutely had to go to India. Mark said that he knew people who were into Ayurveda, and Ayurveda could be a salvation for my mom. I was skeptical of this idea, but what could I do? During our last Skype conversation, I asked my mother to be careful, and it turned out I was right. After this call, I didn't hear anything from my mother for more than a year. My dad and I didn't have her phone number, and my mom's Skype account displayed information that she had been offline since our last conversation. Up to this point, neither my dad nor I would have thought that we would ever be so worried about her life after all she had done to us. But it seemed that this time, it was actually a question of life and death. No matter what kind of person my mother might have been, she certainly did not deserve anything we were thinking of in this situation. My father and I did everything we could. We went to the embassy in India, but you understand, this is a country with a population of more than 1 billion people and an endless tourist flow. And we weren't even sure whether my mother applied for an electronic visa or if they found some other way to enter. And we had known nothing about Mark, let alone his citizenship. Also, we didn't know exactly where in Europe they had lived before they went to India. In general, we were powerless. And after a while, somebody called my dad's number from India. We thought it would be some official representatives, and we prepared for the worst. But it was an ordinary woman who had taken pity on a homeless white woman that she found not far from her home. The woman didn't say anything and only gave her a phone number, asking her to contact us. So you can already imagine how this story ended. Somehow, Mark left my mother without money. I mean, not only without pocket money, but he emptied all of her bank accounts. Then he left her out in the Indian wilderness and just disappeared into the sunset. But for some time before that, my mother was actually receiving some arthritis treatment, so my mom got herself a half dozen local diseases, but her joints don't bother her anymore. Now, my prodigal mother has returned home and lives with us, and if you suddenly meet this Mark in real life, beware. He is a bad person. Share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel.